Okay, turned off some of the lights. Still seems to be enough light here. So, we're going to talk about A World at War, and maybe to a lesser extent a little bit more about Gathering Storm. Although I don't want to touch on it too much as a game itself, it is somewhat interesting, hey, how did it work within A World at War? So, my first impression with A World at War is, or my main impression, is that it's gone overboard. It's just taken it too far. I used to like the old system. I'll bring these out in a little bit. Advanced Third Reich and Rising Sun. I used to like them better than I like with. That was my impression walking into this was, hey, that's a system I really liked. And if they could clean it up a little bit, because, you know, it's this old, clunky Third Reich system being held together. And what I thought was A World at War would only reasonably be streamlining that system, generalizing it, and making it a more cohesive whole. And in some ways they do that, okay? Third Reich, Advanced Third Reich has the old Third Reich naval system. Empire of the Rising Sun has its own naval system, which is close to what is used in A World at War. And one of the things that if you play them together, you start to say is, well, why does it make sense to use the old Third Reich system in Advanced Third Reich? The Brits had carriers certainly available, and, you know, whatever. You should be able to translate that system. And that's essentially what's happened here, is they pushed it over the two games. But that's not all they did. That's most of what they did, though. From what I can tell, A World at War isn't significantly streamlined at all. There's still tons and tons of special cases. There wasn't really a lot of attempt to make things work all the same way. So the different research elements, you got kind of a feeling when you read Rising Sun's research rules that maybe, I don't really remember, that there was an attempt to kind of lump it all together and get it to work on time or something. And unfortunately, A World at War still has that feeling. In fact, all the rules, the political rules, so the diplomacy, everything really feels like there was an attempt not so much to just get it to work, but to get it to work very historically. So a lot of effort was made. Okay, yeah, we can't have a general rule for this. But then there's other things where it's just like, well, if we're going to just bolt all these systems together, sort of, we don't have to worry about trying to make a cohesive whole. And in light of that, you see things where the research rules, like, you know, handle one type of thing in terms of BRP costs, and then another, what seems like a very similar thing. So I think it's strategic bombers are in BRP cost, whereas submarines and special forces and stuff are by the individual unit. And it just kind of, couldn't they do something a little bit easier to handle in the bookkeeping level and in the mental, keeping it all in your mind? Because, and I hate to do this because I'm going to have to take everything out. There's a lot of game here, obviously. These GMT bring stuff to give away at cons, and I picked those up thinking, wow, it might be useful to have more than the original deck. It's not. They're just backups, basically. This is a huge rule book, you know. It's a much larger rule book than Empire of the Rising Sun's rule book, yet other than special rules like, hey, Gibraltar has its own, you know, rules section. And this is the thing, the game is so much a game of by exception, right? Instead of defining how straits work and fortresses work in a way that makes Gibraltar what it is, nah, they make this. And what WIF would do is put a line in or a paragraph that says, hey, Gibraltar, Singapore, and Istanbul control these straits, and this is how that works in Copenhagen, just in one sentence, instead of creating, a paragraph, well, a multi-paragraph rules section on each of them, which may have little differences baked into them to just indicate the tiny little differences from the general case that are there. Well, if you're going to start having those kind of tiny little special cases on individual pieces of terrain, etc., it's almost begging for you to start having much more differentiation on the units. And in some ways, this is the weird thing. Because I think World in Flames and A World at War have this interesting codependency in terms of how they've been handled. So, the whole family that created A World at War. So what you had was Third Reich, came out, went through multiple editions, and Rollins, the designer of World in Flames, probably said, I want more. It's not enough. It's not realistic enough, and it's not the whole world. And so he designed World in Flames somewhere in the mid-'80s, and it gave you the whole world, and it gave you detail on the units, much more military detailed game. And then Advanced Third Reich, Empire of the Rising Sun comes along, expands to meet that case, that general space. And then I don't know which one came up with oil first. I'm assuming World in Flames, looking at it and saying, hey, oil's not enough. It's not handled in the exact correct way. But likewise, World in Flames had to start incorporating aspects of diplomacy that were better handled in the Advanced Third Reich. And there's sort of like this synergy between the two, maybe aiming towards a sort of perfect game. There's things that one does better than the other. Anyway, what's weird is that they both kind of fail to present a single level of detail, right? So World in Flames is fairly simple in terms of how it handles terrain. It tries to make that the simplest as it can. However, it goes into individual units in great detail, and the units are smaller size, smaller scale than what you have in World at War. And by the way, both games solve the Asia to Europe size differential in the same way. They make the maps different scale, and then they each handle it in a slightly different way, how to handle that scale. So Advanced Third Reich prints, Empire of the Rising Sun, prints movement allowances right on the counters, and that translates over to this, which is very helpful. So the terrains are all the same. It's a less detailed representation. What World in Flames does is it comes up with movement point costs for every hex on the different maps, right? So not for every hex, but for every terrain at the different scales, which I think is a more correct way to do things. Certainly more effort is involved in counting the hexes. On the other hand, World in Flames naval rules are incredibly abstracted compared in some ways to how A World at War handles navies. There are things like you don't even have to know what your target is ahead of time when you sail out somewhere to do an invasion or something. And your enemy doesn't know either, though, which is useful because he would have a chance to react because of the pulsed movement system, whereas in A World at War, you don't have that kind of chance to react. So the reaction's baked in an interception capability instead. Speaking of the naval rules, they're one of the places where the game has kind of bloated too much, in my opinion. It's taken on just too much level of detail. So Rising Sun had kind of a neat naval system where it said, okay, we're going to fight out naval battles in more detail with rounds of combat, etc., not just, a single die roll and a single chart. and we're going to enable carrier groups to kind of hide in the midst of the battle and everything. All kind of interesting deployment features towards how you prepare for the battle. Now, that preparation, once you set up a task force, that task force stays together for the entire battle. You can't split that force up, but generally big naval battles are going to have multiple task forces so they can go out searching and all kind of stuff. And it's really not as complex as it's sounding, but it adds a lot of flavor to what's going on in the naval battles. So they have that level of detail in it, which I think works nicely. But what they didn't do was they didn't go to the individual named ships level. And someone always, I remember back when SPI under TSR put out their World War II, I think it's ETO, Eastern Theater of Operations, but, or European Theater. Yeah, I'm always bad with that. And one of the big selling points that at least one of my friends put forward was, well, it's got all the named ships on it. And actually it had 2 ships per counter, and that's very much what WIF started out with. So, like, you know, the Bismarck and the Tirpitz would be on the same counter or whatever. Okay, whatever. But you had the specific named ships, and that was a big advance over a World at War, and that's something that World in Flames did as well. And then that's part of the synergy. Eventually, here in a World at War, as opposed to Advanced Third Reich, they get to those named ships. And I think that was a step too far. It's just too much detail. You know, we don't have too much differentiation between the ground units. For the most part, technology jumps in here, but you had, you know, armored units, which are all pretty much the same value for a given country. Although, again, technology and Gathering Storm play with this. You have infantry that are all pretty much the same size, although some countries have some differentiation. There's some garrison units and stuff like that that are smaller that allow you to, you know, you wouldn't really want them in your front line, but you need them to cover beaches or whatever. But there wasn't any differentiation between the individual units, whereas WIF really went into that. So, like, you know, I don't know, if you've got the Kreisdeutschland division, I don't know, you have divisions in it, but you have corps mainly. The scale isn't representative of what the units are named or anything like that, so you have, like, the Viking Corps. Yeah, okay. Anyway, these units are rated based on their quality, and you kind of get random units, hidden value units, hidden until they get deployed on the map, and then everybody knows about them. And that's all very interesting. You have specific air units that are differentiated by the type of plane and the years they come out, specific naval units the same way. It's all great, but that's WIF, you know, and I think, at least for this player who liked the Advanced Third Reich flavor of things, what was really nice about that was it came in at this lower level than WIF. It said, okay, the military is going to be significantly less detailed. And it was kind of a hard sell to me to say that the Pacific Carrier War, carrier engagements should be at a greater level of detail, especially since I'm kind of blasé at the least about naval roles. But look, it's a naval war. It's got to be the focus of the game, and the truth of the matter is what we saw when I was playing is a big turn in Europe took a lot of time, so it wasn't that big a deal to take about that much time on a single cataclysmic naval battle. Okay, great. Well, this takes it further. It goes to named ships. It goes to pairing off ships and having to fight individually, which I just threw out because that was just getting too far. At very, very minor gains from what I can tell. Trying to think what else on the naval really kind of gets to me. I think that's the big thing was, differentiating the named battleships. Now, there's something nice about that, which is, along with that, a World at War adds shipyards, where not only do you have a shipbuilding limit, but ships are actually located at a specific place while they're being built, which means you have to protect that place, or while they're damaged, or whatever. And that's actually above and beyond what at least my version of World in Flames has. I don't have Factories in Flames, which may cover that. Again, that synergy, that bouncing off of each other, right? My biggest disappointment of all of this is, and I'm doing this right now from the, hey, you already like Advanced Third Reich, right? My biggest disappointment is this rulebook. A number of reasons. One is physically, it's held up through a whole play, but it's unwieldy. And some of that's simply the amount of words they put in it. It has bloated the word count. I looked up one or two specific instances. One sticks to mind, which is the cost in the old rulebook, the cost of conducting an offensive operation. And that is clear as day in the old Advanced Third Reich. And the style of trying to give you some motivation, still not as good as in normal games, but honestly about as good as Avalon Hill ever got. Okay? And by the way, it's the same author. It's Bruce Harper. He did both games, both systems. But here, taking the example of the offensive operations, they turned what was a really simple concept. You do a full offensive, it costs you 15 BRPs. To a special case written thing, let me read it to you. And I mean, the other one really is that simple. And it's in highlights, it's very easy to find in the rulebook. This rulebook makes everything harder to find and deal with once you turn to the page. But first of all, there is no offensive operations rule, I think. Specifically there. Now there it is. Full offensive, 9.63. So they turned what essentially says you pay 15 BRPs for a full offensive, and that means you can move all your units. Now, you can attack with all your units, and you can do naval operations without cost. And it all very, very simply written. And sticks in your mind with no problem at all. And they changed that too. If an alliance faction spends 15 or more BRPs on offensive operations on a front in a turn, the alliance faction is considered to be conducting a full offensive. If a major power spends 15 BRPs on an offensive operation on a front in a turn, all units belonging to that major power and any of its minor allies and associated minor countries may conduct offensive actions on that front without any additional expenditures of BRPs. If a major power spends less than 15 BRPs, only the offensive operations for which it pays the BRP's cost may be conducted. Okay. Well, when you're skimming the rules of something this size, trying to get the feel of the game, I thought they changed the rule, to tell you the truth. Because of that or more, which was that full offensives may be defined as something for 15. Now, I think there is actually a specific flavor to this and a specific difference to this, but I'm not positive. Which is to say that every major power, I think this actually has a difference in meaning, which is to say that every power actually has to pay for all of its units, and once it hits that 15 limit, it can move everything it likes. That's always seemed like a weird rule to me. I think the original was your alliance had to pay 15. I'm not sure, though. There have been other cases where I've found some of these kind of torturous constructions of rules, and I've not been able to discern them on a single pass as to what's going on. And it makes it harder to remember them. And that's really the difficulty with what's been done with this rulebook, is they've bloated the game to where it's much, much more difficult to play. It's much, much more difficult to learn. It's much, much more difficult to remember what you've learned once you learn it. It's harder to find because the rule book is written in a way that it's repetitive, but not entirely so. It feels like they've tried to nail down every special case they possibly can. And it's not, always going to translate easily. Which to me comes down to, this is a game that's only for real fanatics of the system who want to devote themselves to this game as a fairly large chunk of their overall gaming time. Because you can't really explore it and learn it on one play. It has to be the kind of game that, like I once was with SFB, like some people are with ASL, where you're studying the rules, preparing for this, this particular trick or whatever. Well, less of a trick here. You're preparing to try to learn the core of the rules here, which is one of the problems. I feel like the system bloated because players wanted to add all kind of things, wanted to get just this extra little tweak of realism in, and there was just too much probably design via Yahoo Group and too little by people actually trying to hammer it out and make the hard choices correctly. So what was already a bolted together Frankenstein monster has gotten to the point where it's just a little beyond, no, it's more than a little. It's beyond what I can handle. It's beyond what I can handle in almost a geometric fashion, because it's not that the rules themselves have gotten that much more complex, but the additional complexity of the rules, additional mechanical complexity of play, and then what seems to be a differing philosophy towards how to handle the rule book itself, making it less readable for me, less comprehensible, and less of a resource for being able to look things up easily. For many different reasons, but primarily I'm talking about the actual writing style and layout, rather than the physical aspects, which piss me off beyond end as well. And probably, those physical aspects are helping taint my flavor and feel towards this. But I just feel like what they've done is taken a system that you could approach, if you're someone like me, play a couple of games of it, feel pretty comfortable with it. Not that you're going to win or whatever, but that you're mostly playing it right, and not have to be doing constant rules lookups. Maybe there's differences in how I play now with the camera. Maybe there's differences in how old I am and how my brain absorbs information now. But this is not a game I would suggest to anyone who isn't either already addicted to the system and learning it all throughout the time, and really wants more than what they have, and really wants more. Not that they're going to get more play, but they want it so badly that they're willing to pay a huge cost in a number of ways in terms of learning the game and coping with it. The other side of it is, hey, if you want something that, you want a World War II strategic game and you want to study it and learn it, and you want it to be a strongly competitive game. Because I think that's one of the factors in this. So one of the things that comes from it is, even with Gathering Storm's changes to my starting setup, I still got a pretty good game out of it. You can really break the situation in World in Flames by playing Days of Decision, okay? And World in Flames in general is more breakable, right? You can make some really good or really bad decisions that put you in a very, very different position. Now, you can make bad decisions in this that pose you for the game. I'm sure there's no question about that. But I don't think that it's easy to find dominating strategies in this game. I think a serious effort was made to try to keep this a competitive game in the way that many Third Reich players wanted it to be. And that's definitely a bright spot for it, but why do you want to devote so much to it? Well, if you want this to be your game that you study, that you prepare for, and that you play once or twice a year, whatever, in a very competitive manner, this is the game for you, or a choice of a game for you. There are other choices. I would say much, much lower entry barrier. Unconditional surrender is a stronger option, and probably not that much shorter, but significantly more of a balanced the scale is more evenly laid throughout that game. It's more abstracted across the board, just as the military in this. So this is more detailed across the board than everything in Unconditional Surrender, but there are places where it comes close, like the diplomacy rules, etc. There's just more special cases here that don't really feel like they add all that much to the situation, except to try to provide you with maybe a little bit more historical nuance to the accuracy, or to the situation, to prevent you from going even a little bit too far, a little bit into the what if. If you want a true sandbox, this is not your game. You won't whiff. They're really, if you want a true monster sandbox. And that's the thing. The old Advanced Third Reich still wasn't the same kind of sandbox that WIF was. It didn't allow you to really test out your strategies. In WIF, you can, make an attack on India through the Suez Canal or whatever. Here, your scope of what the war is going to be is much more tightly constrained, even when you add Gathering Storm. Part of that may be because Gathering Storm is only in Europe. The actual effects of Gathering Storm were kind of funny, because Germany won my game of Gathering Storm heavily, or the Axis did. I think it did not completely assure an Axis victory in Europe in A World at War. Remember, it has no effect on the Pacific. But it did provide them with some very important factors. So, the biggest of them, not some kind of amazing tech or diplomatic buildup or whatever. The biggest thing that it did was I was able to delay the start of the game and set the timer on Russia to very late. And A World at War has one victory condition for the Axis. Last as long as you can. You're not going to win as the Axis in a World at War. You're not going to defeat the U.S. The U.S. is just going to grow and grow and grow and be able to swing. It doesn't do that in World in Flames. It comes in pretty big and keeps growing and growing and growing, but not at a ridiculous rate. Not at a rate that guarantees the war. And that's that's a philosophical question as far as I'm concerned. Could the Axis have possibly won the war? And here, the best they can do is last out until the end of 46, and then you don't have any more time tracks, so you can't keep playing to see how much worse it goes. Well, yeah, you could. What was really intriguing to me was that my Japanese strategy and perhaps mistakes on the Allied side had them do almost as well as the Germans did. Some of that might be affected a little bit by the Germans coming in so late, so they weren't boosting U.S. entry as well. In fact, I'm pretty sure that is a pretty significant factor. So I had more time for the Japanese to also build out their perimeter. So it does have some effect to use the Gathering Storm in terms of how it's going to work in the Pacific. Overall, though, I still had an interesting game. It wasn't like, oh, well, the Germans won Gathering Storm, therefore, Spain is on their side and Turkey is on their side and everything. Nah, that's pretty. It pretty much I got all the miners and everything more aligned with me, but it still didn't really change the overall situation. We saw Turkey join the Axis, but we saw Spain join the Allies. And in fact, the Spanish revolt didn't happen. So, revolution. So that's kind of where we end up with on that. And overall, I have to say, where to put this? I'm fairly disappointed with what I got out of this. And honestly, I was very worried that I would be from the beginning. I was very worried, when I was ordering this, how much more is it going to add to Advanced Third Reich? I know the components won't be as high a quality, and they're not. The counters are paper thin. The map is a glossy, it's still pretty, but it's a glossy version with the thin paper of nowadays. Interestingly, I meant to mention this, the rulebook actually isn't on that glossy textbook paper. It's not on thick, heavy stock like the old Avalon Hill version was, or like the Gamers games are. But it's also on something with some grain to it, etc. And when you think about it, you have to realize, well, it can't be just for cheapness that people are putting out that glossy paper. That weird, thin, glossy paper, it's got to be a decision that isn't costing them or isn't saving them very much money, if anything. If they can put out a 200 and something page rule book with what's more like standard paper in it. It may have to do with the binding techniques. Who knows? Who knows? But yeah, it's far inferior in terms of component quality. Another thing I didn't touch upon, the amount of paperwork in the game. The old Third Reich, there was basically almost no paperwork. You needed a calculator to figure out your BRPs at the beginning of the year. You put them on a track, and you did your bookkeeping on a chart. Well, I believe Advanced Third Reich did the same thing. You had a little money track. You did find yourself having to keep track of technology picks and some other things. One really nice, and diplomacy, stuff like that. One really nice thing that a World of War does is it gives you a whole bunch of template pages. I wrote right on them because they were the best stock in the game, and they erased fine, But other components are below the quality. So, for example, the card stock for the national sheets for each power, where they put their counters, they put their shipbuilding stuff on them. That is just, the same stuff that you're writing on. It's good. It's heavier writing paper, but it's not any kind of stock that you'd want to put counters on particularly. I also found, and some of this is because of Gathering Storm, I needed another 10 pages or so of diplomatic stuff. There were probably pages that I could use to track what was on here, but this was more convenient. And I gotta say, you end up with 5 or 6 pages per power. You end up with maybe 20 pages, 30 pages of paperwork for this game. And you could limit that a great deal. Back with Advanced Third Reich, I was doing it on scrap paper, and it didn't take up that much space. I didn't have to fill out the tax form, which is highly, redundant. Copy this line down here, divide by this. I found my own methods that worked well. So I don't know how huge an advantage that is. I would rather have some good heavy stock. Another thing is the sheets for each nationality are kind of back printed on other ones that you need. So you can't assemble the grand campaign scenario with just the components that the game has. You either have to put it on crappy photocopy paper or make changes to the sheets or something. Of course, once France drops out of the game, I think that helps a little bit. I think that took some of the pressure off of one of the countries, and I was able to swap things out. But yeah, it was largely a disappointment for me. It didn't add enough. The additional rules, there's very little that I would add to this, to the old Advanced Third Reich Rising Zone. One is, I'd make the naval rules the same for both. Second is, if oil is not part of the old system, and I don't think it was handled in the same way that it is. I think it was handled on you have to just get it. The oil rules are worth having. You need to have some kind of oil rules because oil was such a vital part of the war and reason for some of the strategic planning. So I think actually it handles the oil fairly well. Although there's a lot of mechanical stuff going on that you very quickly learn to just abstract away for countries that don't need to worry about it. Once if you have enough shipping for Britain, they can get their oil in. Stop bothering. Just figure out vaguely how much you need. Pay that. It'll limit how much troops and BRPs you can ship in. Yeah, that's about all I have to say. Now, I'm going to come back with a sort of grand discussion of all the a combined discussion of all the grand strategy games that I have, and maybe a couple that I don't. But I have to wait, because I've got Triumph and Tragedy. I made sure that I would order that, to add that to the pile, because that one looks particularly interesting to me. The Pity of It All, Cataclysm, isn't going to be out. That's the one I was the most interested in out of the 3 new ones came out this year. That was the one I most wanted to investigate. But, oh well. All right, let's send it up.